Hi, Kerstin. Thank you for taking your time today for us and giving us an interview. Hope you're doing fine. And I'm looking forward to hear your input about deindustrial memory. To start the interview, maybe could you give a little introduction about yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
My name is Kerstin Barndt, and I'm an associate professor of German studies here at the University of Michigan. And I'm also the director of the Museum Studies program and a curator. And before coming to Ann Arbor, I worked on several exhibition projects at Dresden's Hygienemuseum. And it was the interdisciplinary nature of the projects on the history of abortion, history of the birth control pill, and the history of sexuality that I was part of the exhibition team and research team that were really important to my understanding and critical reflection of museum work. And to these exhibition projects, I brought my expertise in 20th century women's literature, history, and culture. The artistic experiments of the Weimar Republic and the role of women artists have played in advancing the literary and visual arts have been the focus of much of my writing on women's literature and the history of reading. My museum work has prompted me to collaborate with artists here in Ann Arbor and to complement their artistic practice with cultural historical research. My last exhibition project, Object Lessons, was a combination of 3 years of research into the history of the University of Michigan's academic collections. My current book project, Layers of Time, exhibiting history in contemporary Germany, is most closely related to my presentation today, and it examines changes in how museums of different scale, local and national, represent the history of industrialization and deindustrialization, of migration, and of historical rupture and revolutions, such as the moment of 1989.
Thank you, Kerstin. Could you tell us maybe also what is meant by the concepts deindustrial and the memory of industrialization?
Deindustrialization describes a process of economic and structural change. In German, we have this wonderful word Strukturwandel for that process. The structural change of deindustrialization captures the decline of industrial production within the national economy and the rise of the service sector. That is a long process that started in the 50s through the 1970s. So in 1970, for example, 28% of the workforce in all major global economies was in manufacturing. And that declined to 18% in 1994. In the US, manufacturing peaked in 1965, when 28% of the workforce was employed in manufacturing. And that then fell to 16% in 1994, and then again, declined again between 2000 and 2010. We remember the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and manufacturing now, so only 8.5% of all workers are employed in manufacturing. That is still the 5th largest employer after healthcare, social assistant, retail trade, hotel and food services, administrative services. But manufacturing is still very important, but it only makes up 11% of US gross domestic product as compared to Germany, where we can see the same process of deindustrialization, but manufacturing actually makes up 22% of the domestic product and 24% of the workforce. So if we compare the US with Germany, manufacturing actually holds a more important place within the national economy in Germany than in the US. The industrial memory practices and discourses reflect on the history of manufacturing, industrial production, as materialized in the factory itself. The abandoned factory or coal washing plant can become a memorial site of itself, of its technologies, of work processes, but also of its working class culture that sustained local communities over generations. The memory of the industrial age deliberately brings selected parts of the industrial past into the deindustrial present. As all memory formation, this memory serves the present as much as the past through the preservation of the material remnants of this past, the factories turned into museums, or the technology in the factories, the work processes, but also through other memory media, photography, art, novels, documentaries, family stories, and other narratives that speak of the generational and societal impact and affect of industrialization and deindustrialization. So if we talk about deindustrialization, we also talk about industrialization. The two are really linked and connected and cannot be thought through independent of each other.
And could you also maybe explain why some people feel the certain nostalgia for industrial sites and the associated ways of life?
Nostalgia comes from the Greek, nostos, homecoming, and algos, pain. And if we think about nostalgia, we think about an emotion that has a bittersweet ting to it. Nostalgia kicks in when we feel and process loss. It can also be described as a sentimental longing to return to moments in the past when we felt happy, or we felt we felt safe, we felt in a good community, we felt at peace. Deindustrialization has threatened working class communities, in particular with poverty, marginalization, and a sense of being thrown onto the garbage heap of history. Developing a sense of nostalgia around industrial heritage might feel empowering for those communities. And there might even be a sense of pride in the past. So if your family's income and well-being is linked to the factory or coal mine that is now closing, this abstract structural change becomes very personal. The factory's neglect and abandonment may mirror your own sense of being cut off from life. This mirroring of your own state of mind in the industrial ruin and your longing for a more whole past that includes the flourishing of this industrial sector is something that develops organically. So the steelworks, mine, or factory might have been so linked to your identity that you feel lost without it. That's the personal level. And that loss, of course, has grave material and economic consequences, as in unemployment or poverty. On a societal level, nostalgic worshippers of industrial sites may also include people who have never worked at the plant or mine. For them, 19th century or early 20th century industrial architecture symbolizes a time of unchecked national growth and might that arc from the 1890s into the 1960s. While disrupted by deep recessions and 2 world wars, this time frame includes the period of post-war reconstruction in both German states, and in particular, the Federal Republic's miracle years, the Wirtschaftswunder, a time when war-torn cities were cleared of rubble and houses and factories rebuilt. In my writings on the topic, and in particular in reference to Peter Latz's Landschaftspark Duisburg Nord, with its massive blast furnace, I have coined the notion of ruin optimism that playfully reinserts industrial ruins into a leisure time park scenery. For Slavist Svetlana Boym, Latz's playful reframing of the industrial ruins would serve as an example of reflective nostalgia, a form of nostalgia that is not backward-looking, fixed, or restorative, but rather works through the pain of loss via aesthetic forms of poetic play, irony, reflection, and even humor.
Thanks. Also, that some of your work concerns Detroit and its car industry, for example. Would you tell us something about that?
So if we think about the car industry and Detroit, we think of the big three car companies in the US, General Motors, the Ford Motor Company, and Chrysler, which is now Stellantis. All of these three car factories started in Detroit and still have headquarters in or near Detroit. So it's kind of like thinking about Wolfsburg, Stuttgart, and Munich, that house the three big car companies in Germany together in one place. So there's an enormous identification between Detroit and the US car industry. Now, if we think about deindustrialization, we have to consider that actually the car industry is still very important for both national economies in the US and Germany. But the plants that were built close to the center of Detroit have now moved outside of the center of Detroit. We still have very important car manufacturing plants in Michigan, but they are not as important as there were ones at the beginning of the 20th century and into the 60s. So deindustrialization here, if we think about it in relationship to the car industry, also means globalization, and that an economy that once was national and had national importance is now a global economy. And all of these corporations that started in Detroit are now global corporations.
Thank you. So, American manufacturing is part of this mythologization of the US as inventive, progressive, economically prosperous, and world dominant. What impact has the decline in manufacturing had on America's idea and myth of itself?
So let me bring us back to this complicated relationship between the memory of the industrial age and car manufacturing. Because, as I said, cars are still being manufactured in Germany and in the US. Deindustrialization, if we think about economies that are in decline or that really stand for an end of a certain age, we think about coal, we think about the closing of mines, we think about steel. We don't necessarily go to the car industry. In Detroit, though, if you drive through the inner city of Detroit, you cannot not see ruins of former car manufacturing plants. And these ruins are striking because these car manufacturing plants, like the Packard plant, were enormous in size. The Packard plant actually was the largest car manufacturing plant. It was built in 1903, enlarged in 1908, and the largest and most modern car manufacturing plant of its day, designed by industrial architect Albert Kahn, who also designed Ford's enormous car factories in Detroit and near Detroit, the Highland Park Ford plant and the River Rouge Ford plants. And all of these three historic plants, the Packard plant, the Highland Park Ford plant, and the River Rouge Ford plant, still exist in ruins and are being memorialized in very different ways. At its height in the 1930s, 10,000s of workers produced Packard cars in the Packard plant until the car manufacturing stopped. And the plant stopped building cars in 1956. And then that structure was still used for other businesses until the 1990s, when it was abandoned. And that's when sort of a new cycle of fame began with music raves. Detroit's music scene moved into the ruin. The graffiti scene imbued the ruin with new life. Ruin scavengers came in and turned everything that was still, that they could still turn into money, took that out, took all the wiring out, so that what we see now is really the concrete that the plant was famous for when it was built. That's what's left. And all efforts to somehow redevelop the structure have failed. The Highland plant, the Highland Park Ford plant, the first big Ford plant with the first vertical integration assembly line, was used by Ford into the 50s, when it then demolished large parts of that industrial complex. And it moved all car and truck manufacturing to the River Rouge plant that opened in 1927 and became sort of Ford's signature, world famous manufacturing plant. And what is interesting for my own work is that Rouge plant that opened in 1927 is the first plant that was built outside of Detroit's city boundaries in Dearborn, still close to Detroit, but outside of the city. So it was sort of the first move beyond Detroit, the first move to expand car manufacturing to other parts of the US, and then even outside national borders. And while this expansion and restructuring of car manufacturing took place, Henry Ford also considered the loss of certain ways of manufacturing, and he was very eager to memorialize the beginning of his company and the places where his first car, the famous Model T, was designed and built. And so only 2 years after he opened that enormous River Rouge Ford plant, he also opened his museum, the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village.
Thanks. Could you also tell us something about the Henry Ford Museum, maybe?
So the Henry Ford Museum has two sides to it, two parts. A museum that assembles cars, that is about transportation, that is about the history of cars, the history of the leisure economy, the history of consumption, the history of travel. That is all an indoor, that happens indoor. It's an indoor museum with real cars, with real planes, very similar to industrial museums that we know in Germany from in Munich, the Deutsches Museum, or Berlin has the Technisches Museum. So you see big structures, and through these big structures, history is being told, that the history of innovation, the history of ingenuity, of creativity. And then you have this other part, which is an outdoor museum called Greenfield Village that assembles houses, structures, the homes of important American innovators like Edison, but also the Henry Ford's own childhood home, parts of the garage where he started to design the Model T, but also that you also find farmland there, a little farm. So it's really a dream place. Greenfield Village is a dream place that transmutes the rupture of industrialization into a peaceful, neighborly relationship between pre-industrial and industrial America. Farmland borders on Edison's and Ford's laboratories, and you see horses, you smell horses, but you also see and hear the sounds and exhausts of vintage Model T cars. So it's a very experiential space, and visitors love visiting both the museum and Greenfield Village. The complex is now called the Henry Ford, and it's the most visited museum space in Michigan.
All right, thanks. So, you know, American manufacturing is part of this whole mythologization of the US as an inventive, progressive, economically prosperous, and world-dominant place. And what do you think, what impact has the decline in manufacturing had on America's idea and myth of itself?
Well, this is a big question. It's a sociological question. The first answer that comes to your mind probably, and also to my mind, is Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again policy and discourse. He positioned himself as the answer to this decline of US global and economic might in an era of globalization. And he built his base and based his populism on this restoration of US might via a chauvinistic and nationalistic America First model. And what is really striking, what was striking for us while we lived through this, through these 4 years, and still live in the shadow of these 4 years, is that at no time before an economy first model, the economy first model was really pronounced. So it was all about the economy. It was all about, it was sort of on the face of it, it was also about American workers. But when you were really looking closer at it, the numbers that mattered most were the stock market numbers. And these numbers were being pushed to the forefront on the expense of everything else: healthcare, education, social welfare, solidarity, and democracy. So we have really seen that sort of, we have seen the downside of the dark side of this economy first idea or ideology that had real detrimental effects on basic democratic norms, on the idea of the commons, on the idea of society and what holds society together. So there was a disconnect between economic gain, most visible in rising stock markets, and the growing gap between super rich, rich, and poor, between BIPOC Americans and white populations. And COVID-19 has exacerbated these inequalities.
And you've also worked on industrial sites in the Ruhr area in Germany, where I'm from, and where also the universities in Essen and Duisburg are. Are there any comparisons to be drawn between the US and Germany, you think?
Industrial heritage in Germany was, as heritage, sort of, it took some time before industrial sites were recognized as heritage. And that really had to do with the fact that more and more industrial sites, mines, were closing in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And the question arose, what should we do with these sites? Should we protect them? Should we turn them into monuments, into Denkmäler? And there was no legal framework to do that. So citizen initiatives actually in the Ruhr region and beyond worked to protect industrial architecture. And many of these sites, especially in Rhineland-Pfalz and in North Rhine-Westphalia, were then eventually turned into museums. So now we have a Ruhr region dotted with industrial museums in former mines, factories, power stations. We have the Bergbau Museum in Bochum, which was actually the first museum that was founded. We have former slag heap hills that are inviting hikers to explore the artworks at their top. And we have former coal mines and mining landscapes that are turned into parks, into lake districts, or event arenas that integrate former mining architecture, steelworks, and excavators to make the scenery look more sublime. All of this work in Germany has been supported by public funds and integrated into city and regional planning. In the US, this process, so in Germany, we can really look back to the 80s when that process of the musealization of industrial sites really quickened and turned into results, and museums were founded. But that process, we can also see how long that process took. So the last museum, the Ruhr Museum, that moved into the former coal washing plant of Zeche Zollern, opened in 2008. So it's a process from the 1980s to the 19-teens. And in the US, one of the first sort of public parks that are similar to the public park, Peter Latz Park, was the Seattle Gasworks Park. So there is a similarity between the park that was built around this gasification plant in Seattle and Peter Latz's Essen Park. But if we think about museums of industrial history, that really is more a recent development in the US. And only in 2016, the National Museum of Industrial History opened in the electrical repair shop of a former steel plant in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is really still is an important manufacturing base for the US economy, but had a manufacturing base that has lost much of its plans to closings and to globalization. In Pittsburgh, you can visit the Kerry blast furnace and tour it with tour guides, similar to tours that are offered in former closed steelworks and coal mines in the Ruhr region, where you also have former workers of these plants they now have become these tour guides. And that is also a form of memory work that they perform in this way, that they guide visitors who are interested in learning about the history of these plans. And they can sort of, they can give some of their knowledge to the next generation and pass it on this way.
Thank you. Do you think there are differences in the ways in which the industrial past is commemorated in the former GDR and the Federal Republic of Germany?
Yes, there are real differences. And these differences are based in the different kinds of coal mining that existed. So we had Steinkohle, hard coal in the Ruhr region, and then we have brown coal or lignite in Lusatia. That is sort of between Berlin, Dresden, and Leipzig. That area was the industrial powerhouse of the GDR, where the big industries were the mining, the lignite mining, and that lignite mining was open cast mining, so you didn't dig deep into the earth. You sort of took away layers of soil, which produced very different post-mining landscapes than the slag heap hills that you now have in the Ruhr region. In contrast, these deep holes in the landscapes are now filled with water. They are turned into new lake districts. The similarity here are that both of these new landscapes are landscapes of leisure and not so much landscapes of work anymore. And both the process of deindustrialization in the FRG and in the new states that once belonged to the GDR were accompanied by large-scale international building exhibitions. So you had the IBA Emscher Park in the Ruhr region from 1989 to 1999, so the first decade after unification. And then that was followed by an international building exhibit or Internationale Bauausstellung Fürst-Pückler-Land in Lusatia. And both of these building exhibits built these new landscapes and were really instrumental in accompanying the structural change that was happening. And they accompanied that structural economic change by redirecting perception, by thinking about this landscape in creative ways, by recreating a new way of feeling anchored in this landscape, of feeling at home in this landscape, of shifting the identification with the landscape of labor and work and industry to a landscape of nature, of bicycling, of touring, of hiking, of leisure time. So it was quite radical what happened there, and my work accompanied these landscape projects and how they succeeded and not so much succeeded in framing this transition aesthetically, how they helped or how they helped the people that were impacted by the closure of the factories to work through this loss, but how they also helped, and that was more successful in the rural region than in Lusatia, to turn these landscapes into landscapes of tourism that attracted people from other regions to come to visit the industrial museums, the landscape parks, the slag heap hills, and their art. So in the GDR, I also wanted to add, in the GDR, the moment of '89 was, of course, also a moment of an end of a state. And when I visited the projects that were part of IBA Fürstpücklerland, you could see that double layering. You could see that the loss of the industry, the end of the lignite mining plant, was exasperated by the end of state socialism. And both of these ruptures, the industrial rupture, an end of an industry, and the end of a state, mirrored each other.
And what do you think, what role can museums and other forms of commemoration play in addressing the needs of such communities?
Yeah, that goes back to two thoughts I've articulated earlier in this interview. I think that museums and these landscape projects are they are offerings. They can offer these communities places of identification. They can offer these communities places in which reflections on the past, but also on the present, and visions of the future can be developed together. It really depends on how the museums work and how open the museums are to the communities they serve. I have to say, I have looked into this more closely with regard to the Ruhr Museum in Essen that moved from being close to the Volkwang Art Museum now into the closed mine and into the coal washing plant. And if you look at the exhibitions and the community involvement that this particular museum has invited, so this particular museum has always invited the community in. They have done oral history projects. They have worked with migrant communities in the area. They have and the migrant museum, the migrant communities, the Turkish-German communities, and other communities, the Polish community. They have really worked with communities in the plural and have tried to reach out and have tried to make their historical work meaningful for the communities they serve. And all of that happened during that long and slow process of structural change. And it is, not a coincidence that this museum has now found a new home in an industrial ruin. And they have made very creative and good use of this ruin. Now, I also think that this new place in the Zeche Zollern might have also moved this museum a little bit away from the sort of community base, but that needs to be seen. We have to see what kind of programs they are developing in the future.
Thank you. What role does race play in post-industrial memory?
So the rise of the auto manufacturing, of car manufacturing, and of the big three car manufacturers in Detroit is not thinkable without African-American workers and without the Great Migration. And even though they were hired, African-American workers were discriminated against, and there was a segregation between the parts on the assembly line where the African-American workers could work and where the white workers could work. So although Ford hired African-American workers, there was segregation inside the factory. And that segregation, as we all know, has persisted throughout the decades until today, but it has found different forms. So in Detroit, it has always been very difficult, almost impossible in the early half of the 20th century for African Americans to buy land or to buy a house. There was redlining, real estate agents came up with all kinds of rules and regulations that prohibited African Americans from buying housing. So the city itself became a segregated space, and the police discriminated against and harassed and violated the lives of African Americans. And a pivotal moment in Detroit's history is the race rebellion. Other people say the race riots of 1967, when the city erupted in 5 days of fights against the police force, and 56 people died, hundreds were injured, and hundreds of houses burned down. And after that rupture, after that rebellion, we saw an enormous sort of, we saw a quickening of what had already happened, which is being described as white flight, so that the suburbs in turn grew exponentially and gave home to the white population, whereas African Americans remained in the inner city, which is now predominantly Black. And you also see that mirrored in the museums that are at the heart of the city. So at the heart of the museum center of Detroit, we have the Detroit Institute of Arts, a big national art museum. And then we have the Detroit Historical Museum and the Charles Wright Museum of African American History. And Detroiters still think of these two history museums as the White History Museum and the Black History Museum. And the events of 1967 were revisited 100 years later. 50 years later, it was the anniversary became a moment of revisiting that history. And both museums, the Charles Wright Museum and the Detroit Historical Museum, worked together to curate a really outstanding exhibition about that history.
Great, thank you, Kerstin. And now the last question of our interview. Does growing awareness about climate change alter the ways in which post-industrial sites are commemorated today, you think?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I have thought a lot about this question while I was researching the Ruhr Museum, but also while I was researching these landscape projects that are linked to these, that were linked to these international building exhibits in Lusatia and in the Ruhr region. What was so striking to me was how nature now became this force that not only showed us where the coal that we had burned throughout the last 100 years came from, that it was made via the force of the sun and built up over millions of years. But we now also, the forces of nature were now also called upon to mediate, to alter, to pacify, to move this, to move the scars of the industrial age and to heal these scars. And so these new lake districts were produced in the mining landscape of Lusatia, and in the Ruhr region, we have these parks and gardens and hills, greened hills. And the Ruhr Museum, again here for me, is an example for what I call layered history, and that these layers of history now, if we think about industrial history, we think about it as part of other histories that are as important as the industrial history, that is natural history, that is social history, that is the history of labor, that is the history of migration. And nature really, and the sort of longue durée of nature, and the violence that humans have done to nature, and environmental history is another history that is now being brought into the considerations of industrial history at the Ruhr Museum. And we see sort of how we really, in the Ruhr Museum, we see how industrial history is part and essential to what we now think of the Anthropocene, and think about how humans have altered geology and the geological layers of the earth, and how humans have extracted the richness of the earth, and how we now think about structural change that also needs to move us away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And museums can play a role in making us see these layers in one space, to really get a sense of the complexity of these historical processes. In the Ruhr region, I would point to the landscape parks into the Ruhr Museum. In Detroit, on the other hand, where we don't have that level of state interest and planning and landscape projects, and cultural creativity. I mean, we have cultural creativity on another scale happening in Detroit. Detroit is now also a city of artists and of, I talked about Detroit as a city of music. But what we now also find in Detroit is that in the gaps that opened up through the destruction of housing and industry in the last 20 years, thousands of community gardens and urban gardens have been created and sustained. And in these urban gardens, the local food economy is based. And in Michigan as a state, but especially in Detroit as a city, we really think about these urban gardens as the base for a new local food economy that is also an answer to global warming.
All right, thank you, Kerstin. This has been a great interview, and now we've come to the end already. Thank you so much for all your thoughts and your input on this topic, and it's been a great exchange, and I'm sure the students will really appreciate everything you've said. So thank you for that, and I hope you're staying safe and well and healthy, and see you soon. Bye.